Hey, everybody. Today I'm going to interview Dr. Judith Lichtenberg, and we're going to talk about life sentences.
So my name is Judy Lichtenberg. I retired 3 years ago from my position as a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University, where I taught for about 13 years. Before that, I taught for 25 years at the University of Maryland, both in the philosophy department and at a place called the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy. And I've always taught and written about ethics and political philosophy. I have a couple of books. I've always taught in my ethics and philosophy of law classes, taught punishment, subject of great interest to philosophers. But it was only about it was 7 or 8 years ago that I had the opportunity to go into a prison, and that began kind of a second career for me.
Wonderful, wonderful. So you wrote an article about life sentences without parole, and I was hoping that you could summarize your argument in the article.
So I've written a couple of articles. I wrote one for a law review about 4 years ago on called Against Life Without Parole, if I'm remembering correctly. And I was pretty happy with that article until I realized that I really was interested in a broader thesis, that I wasn't just against life without parole. I was against life sentences generally and very long and harsh sentences. And I wrote a short article for Eon, more popular outlet than the Washington University Jurisprudence Review, where I had published the first one, arguing against life sentences more generally. And again, I've been thinking about this for a long time, and it's become especially salient as I've gotten to know many prisoners, primarily men, but not exclusively, serving very, very long sentences. So at both Jessup and the DC jail, there are people who had been serving, more than 20 years, sometimes 30 or 40 years for crimes they committed, often murder. In many cases, they were very young. They were either juveniles under 18, or they were what's now called emerging adults, people between 18 and 25, when the brain science now tells us people are not fully mature. Sometimes they were older. One of my all-time favorite students was 30 when he committed a double murder, and he recently was released after 32 years. I would trust him with my life. Anyway, I began to wonder about these kinds of sentences and whether they could be justified. And the more I thought about it, the more it became clear to me that if such sentences can be justified, they can only be justified on retributive grounds. So philosophers and others generally divide justifications for punishment into two broad categories. One is sort of forward-looking, utilitarian, consequentialist justifications. The other are backward-looking, deontological, retributive justifications. Those are mouthfuls to non-philosophers. But basically, we all know what retribution means, even if we're not philosophers. So there's the retributive justifications that say a person should suffer punishment if they were responsible for their crime. They were, not legally insane or any one of a number of such excuses. If they were responsible, they deserve to suffer. It's a good thing that they suffer. Punishment is a good, not an evil. That's a retributive justification versus forward-looking, public safety-oriented justifications, which say we got to punish people in order to send a message to other people that they shouldn't commit crimes, or to incapacitate dangerous people so that they themselves can't harm other people. So those are the two kinds of justifications, forward-looking and backward-looking. And it became clear to me after studying the large literature on punishment by criminologists, social scientists, philosophers, legal theorists, that forward-looking justifications will not justify life sentences or long sentences. So if you think of the two main aspects of a forward-looking justification, one is what's called general deterrence, that we have to send a message to other people who might potentially be contemplating committing a crime. We have to send a message to them that this is what happens if you do that. You're going to go to prison for a very, very long time, or maybe you're going to be executed even. Well, that's not a convincing justification for long sentences, because it depends on the idea that people are going to be more deterred by a life sentence than they are by, say, a 20-year sentence. And the evidence just doesn't support that. And for a variety of reasons, some people aren't deterrable at all. People who commit crimes of passion or that sort of thing may not be deterrable at all. But even people who are somewhat deterrable, as most, let's say, rational people are not, they're not thinking about the consequences of what they're doing. They're not thinking that they're going to get caught. There are so many steps between committing a crime and getting caught. For all these reasons, the evidence shows that people are not more deterred by a very long sentence than by a shorter sentence. If you were thinking of committing a crime, you wouldn't be thinking, oh, if this were just if this were a life sentence, then I really wouldn't do it. But if it's a 20-year sentence, maybe I would do it. So people aren't deterred in that way. And so that's not a reason for having long sentences. General deterrence is not a reason. What about specific deterrence, that we want to lock people up so that they personally will not continue to harm society? Well, there too, the evidence shows that people age out of crime. Crime is a young person's game. And so somebody who commits murder at 20 is unlikely to do that at 50. Generally, they say people age out of crime around middle age, around 40. We can argue about the dates, but in any case, the argument that we have to keep people locked up for life, yes, there are a few people, there are handfuls of people who need to be locked up for life, who will always be a danger to society. But that's not true of the vast majority of people who commit crimes. So it seems to me clear that if there is a justification for very long sentences, life sentences, death sentences, then it has to be based on retributive considerations. The idea that if you take someone's life, for example, then you deserve to have your life taken, or you deserve to have your life so cut short from a normal life that would justify a life sentence. So it seems to me that that's the only justification for that works in general. I mean, again, there are examples. There are people who will always be a danger, but as a general justification, only retribution, I think, can warrant very long sentences. I'll give you a chance to, if you want to intervene here, or
Yeah, I just have a question.
Yeah.
So when you said that people age out of crime, crime is like a young person's game. Is it the idea that people just become more peaceful as they get older? Like, is it like a hormonal change? Like maybe they have less testosterone as they get older or something?
I'm not going to speculate, although there are lots of people who have evidence about this. I mean, I think it's partly that, if you're even a cat burglar, you're not that agile once you're 50. And, so it's partly physical, but it's also many other things. It's psychological. It's the fact that a lot of people will have changed their attitudes. I haven't even spoken of that. I mean, that many of the people I have met teaching in prison, who have been in prison for 10, 15, 20 years, they're not the same people they were. And, of course, what led them to do what they did in the first place was the result of lots of tough circumstances they found themselves in. So it's not that they were all bad people, but to answer your question, come back to your question, yeah, I think it's a combination of, the physical demands of the criminal life on the one hand, and changes in attitude and outlook on the other, and maybe some other things besides.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I'm 37 right now. And I would just say, like, just after turning 30, I felt like I had less energy. I felt like I got injured more. Like my injuries take longer to recover. I felt like there was some significant biological, physiological change when I became 30. So I mean that rings true to me. Okay, so going back to, you were saying that there were two different types of ways to justify punishment. One's forward-looking and one's backward-looking. The forward-looking one is the kind of like the deterrence argument, right? Like, we need to send a message to other people that if you commit a crime, you're going to be punished, right? So
Two kinds of deterrence, that what you just said, and also specific deterrence, or what is sometimes called quarantine or incapacitation, that actually taking the person who has caused harm out of circulation. So
yeah,
both those
okay.
things. And I think neither of them works to justify long sentences.
Okay. And the reason why it doesn't work for deterring other people is because people aren't necessarily calculating the pros and cons when they, commit something like murder, right? Like, so that would be one. And then for the separating the violent individual from the rest of society, that type of deterrence wouldn't justify it because people just kind of age out of that violent behavior.
Right.
Okay. So then the only way that we could justify something like life sentences is this backward looking approach, which is retribution. They need to be punished. They need to suffer.
Right. And, I think if you push carefully on people when they talk about long sentences, I mean, I think that becomes quite clear that there really is this deep retributive idea that people deserve this. And, some people would say, you take someone's life, you should have your life taken. So the question is that a good argument? Does retribution or retributivism, I think of retributivism as the theory and retribution as the practice, just not to be confusing about the terms. So that became my question. Can these sentences be justified on retributive grounds? And I should say right away that I don't think this is that leads to the more general question: is retribution a good justification for punishment generally? And if you ask me, am I a retributivist? After all these years, I'm still not sure if I am or not. Now, that sounds very odd. You ought to know, you're a philosopher. You've been thinking about these things for your whole career. How can you not know? But I do think that this is a kind of bedrock question, whether we should be retributivists. Now, of course, the question is, what does it mean to be a retributivist? But at the very least, it means that we think that a person ought morally to suffer for the wrongs that they do voluntarily and responsibly, let's say, and leaving aside for the moment how much should they suffer and all that. But if the question is it a good thing that people undergo punishment, good for its own sake, that they suffer punishment if they've done wrong? And I do think that that's kind of a bedrock question that, some people will say, obviously, yes. And, if you're a utilitarian, then you think no, because you think all suffering is bad. And if suffering is justified, it's justified only because it produces more good on the whole. I don't think I'm not a utilitarian or a pure consequentialist, but I'm still not sure if I think that the suffering of someone who's done wrong is inherently a good thing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a position on this either, but it does seem to be a part of what we consider to be like justice, or just what, like, we think it's good when people get what they deserve, right? So like, we can imagine a scenario where somebody who's just evil and does very evil things, but gets the greatest goods in life. That would be bothersome,
Yeah, absolutely.
like, and it's, so we think that they should if you're an evil person, that they should suffer the consequences, right? And that good people should receive the benefits. So, obviously, our society doesn't work like that, but we want it to work
That's
like
why we
that.
believe in heaven and hell, so that things will be righted in the
Yeah.
next life. Yeah, so we do think, I mean, this is justice, that people get what they deserve. So there's a very powerful natural impulse to believe that, first of all, and lots of evolutionary arguments about why we have those feelings and all that. I'm not sure in the end whether we should be retributivists or not. But there's, first of all, a strong reason to think that this is an ineliminable feature that a lot of people experience. And the idea that we really can't do with it. We can't function in this world without holding people responsible, and that partly means thinking that they ought to suffer punishment and ought to be blamed and all that. This is a huge can of worms. But what I try to show is that even if we are retributivists, and again, partly because I'm not sure myself, and partly because I don't want my argument against life sentences to depend on the idea that retributivism is wrong, because that would turn off a lot of people. And this isn't just a strategic point, but I really think it's true that I want to try to show how a reasonable retributivism does not require life sentences, death sentences, and all that. So how do I do that is the question. And so it's a several part argument. So the first part is to say, okay, so what is retributivism? And, the most simple version that people have adopted and, might be the person in the streets interpretation is, an eye for an eye. But it's easily shown why we shouldn't accept that, because it would seem to follow that if it's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, then we should torture the torturer and rape the rapist. And most people kind of stop short of that. They think, no, we shouldn't do that. Now, that, of course, raises the question, why shouldn't we? Let's say we agree that we shouldn't. Why shouldn't we? And some people might say that the rapist, deserves to be raped, but we shouldn't do it because it would kind of degrade us. So it's not because they don't deserve it, but it's because of something about what it would do to us to do it. Other people might say nobody deserves to be raped. Even the rapist doesn't deserve to be raped. So those are two reactions you might have. But in any case, I think we agree that you shouldn't torture the torturer and rape the rapist. And that shows that retributivism doesn't mean equality of crime and punishment. So what does it mean? Well, people have offered, I wish there were a better term, something called proportional retributivism, that you should be punished in proportion to your crime. And at the very least, that seems to mean that the worst crimes should get the worst punishments, the next worst punishments. And of course, that's a sort of a metaphor. I mean, how do you make these judgments? But we do make these judgments of a kind of ordinal ranking of crimes and punishments. Murder is the worst, then maybe rape or torture. And we could disagree about some of the rankings. But so the idea is that the worst crimes get the worst punishments, et cetera, down the line. And then the question is, well, how bad should the worst punishments be to not violate either the humanity of the people imposing the punishments or the humanity of the people suffering the punishments? And of course, there can be a lot of disagreement about that. And some people will say, let's say a life sentence for murder does not violate that in the way that raping the rapist would violate that. So it's not conclusive that a life sentence is a violation of the humanity of either the prisoner or the punisher.
Yeah, it
But
sounds like you would have to argue for that.
Yeah, you might have to argue for that. You would have to argue for that in some way. And I do argue for it and here I'm then saying, okay, at least we've established that retributivism doesn't in any way entail that somebody who kills should be killed or should have spend their life in prison. And now I want to show why there are various other considerations that further limit what the just punishment is. And so the first one that comes to mind is, sort of mitigating circumstances. And, when you see, for example, the enormous racial and socioeconomic disparities in prisons and in people serving long sentences. I live in Maryland, which has one of the greatest racial disparities in the country. Black people especially, serving life sentences and very long sentences. And there's the question about, just the sheer racial disparity and what we should make of that. But even apart from that, the circumstances that lead people to crime, when you see that if you grow up in Baltimore, the chance of your not just being a victim of crime, but of being a perpetrator of crime is, vastly greater than if you grow up somewhere else. And so I chose to look at Baltimore compared with Frederick, Maryland, a city about 30 miles west of Baltimore, a small city, where the chance of your ending up committing murder is like 30 times higher if you grew up in the inner city of Baltimore. Now, of course, some people will say, oh, but there are all those people who grow up in Baltimore that don't become murderers. Still, it strikes me as blind not to think that this is relevant, that if you grow up in an environment with, poverty, lack of employment, all your role models are drug dealers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that's not relevant to determining your responsibility. It seems to me, now it doesn't follow, we don't say, okay, you're not responsible and it's okay. Of course, it's not okay, but it does seem to me that it has some bearing on what your punishment ought to be.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I feel like this particular issue is a good one that can illustrate the different way of thinking that liberals have versus conservatives. Because in my experience, liberals tend to focus on social inequalities and social injustices. They focus on how institutions affect individual behaviors, whereas conservatives mainly focus on individual behaviors and individual virtues.
Yeah, I think that's true, but it does strike me as nearsighted, shall we say, that not to take these things into account. Now, people worry, if you start doing that, you're going to fall down the slippery slope and nobody is responsible. And I agree, we can't go there. And in fact, there's interesting work about how holding people responsible also gives them the sort of psychological opportunity to realize that they could also change, which if they thought they were completely determined, they might not be able to think. So we have to hold people responsible, but the idea that these kinds of circumstances, which are so unfairly distributed in our society, aren't relevant to how we punish people and how we treat them, just strikes me as a mistake. Another relevant issue is, what happens if somebody serves 20 years and they're a completely different person now, and they're not dangerous, and they're not, they could contribute to society, and they're no longer the person that they were. Is that relevant to their punishment? Now, some people will say, no, it's not relevant. They did it back then, and that's all that matters. And it is actually incredible to me that parole boards, for example, I know in Maryland this is true, somebody can come up for parole 30 years later. They have a completely clean record. They've gotten a bachelor's degree. They've taken done 1 million programs in substance abuse, and they've become a peer counselor. They've done everything imaginable. And the parole board is still focusing on the circumstances of the crime that person did 30 years earlier. And that strikes me, it's strange on a lot of grounds that on the one hand, you want to say, is this person the same person that they were 30 years ago? And, that gets us into deep philosophical thickets about the nature of
Yeah.
personal identity.
Yeah, I was just about to bring that up. Like, I wasn't sure how extreme you were going to take that, because it could be to the point where it's literally not the same person.
Yeah, I don't want to go that far, and I don't want to get into those kinds of debates. But for it strikes me, for the purposes before us in these matters, the person is a different enough person that they know what they did, they have suffered. If they have changed, I think it's almost axiomatic to say, if they have changed in the way I'm describing, then they must have suffered because of what they did, because they know they've taken a life. And I know people in this situation, and yes, they have to live with that always. But so the question is that relevant to the length of punishment? And of course, some people would say, well, if there's any chance that the person, you never know, and that person might go on to commit a crime if we let them out. Now, first of all, it's important to point out that that is no longer a retributive argument. That's a forward-looking argument that this person is still might be a danger to society. Well, again, there's a lot of evidence that that's not the case. And people, for the reasons we talked about, people age out of crime. And there's just empirical evidence showing that people who get out after 20 or 30 years for the most serious crimes do not recidivate. But even leaving that aside, the idea that the assumption behind the person who says, oh, but they might go on to commit a crime is the assumption is that leaving them in prison has no costs. That, yeah, they might commit a crime, so we better be safe and leave them in prison for the rest of their life. But of course, that has costs too. First, of course, the financial costs, tens of thousands of dollars a year to incarcerate someone, and increasing very exponentially as they get older, and people age faster in prison than they would outside. So you're considered elderly at something like 55. Horror of horrors to me. But there are the people on the outside, the families and the communities who are paying costs for that person's incarceration and for their loss to the community. So it's not like leaving them in prison is, oh, we can just do that and that's fine. But if we let them out, then they might commit a crime. So I think that's that's a rebuttal to the argument that how do we know that they've changed? And I guess the third point I would make about why, even though I want to say the retributive argument, we can't throw it away. We should probably punish people for a while for what they've done for a variety of reasons. But I think the value of there's a value in forgiveness and recognition of a person's humanity and the ability to allow them to rejoin society. That is a value also that the pure retributive argument doesn't recognize.
Yeah, no, I think those are pretty fair points. I wonder if, in addition to these people who've served such long sentences have changed, in addition to that, you may say, well, a lot of these crimes are committed when they're young, right? They're like young adults. And because of that, we want to give them a little more slack, right? Like their brains had fully developed. And so, young people, they take risks, right? They do things that other people tell them not to do, right? It's almost kind of like part of their nature, or they're more likely to do that. And so that also has to be taken into consideration.
Very much so. And so a lot of the legislation that's being introduced now to lessen sentences focuses first and foremost on juveniles, people under 18, and there have been various juvenile restoration acts around the country. And then the next sort of juvenile 2.0 is people 18 to 25, 25 being the age at which the scientists say that the brain reaches full development. Maybe it's 30 actually. It's interesting though, because I've been involved in a working group that's looking to introduce legislation in Maryland for a Second Look Act to give people who have served a certain number of years a second look, not a guarantee that they would get out, but the possibility. And there's been debate in the group about whether we should start small and say, okay, this is for people 18 to 25. The juveniles have already been taken care of. Or whether we should go for the whole 9 yards and say anybody who's served 20 years, even if they were 30 when they were convicted or committed the crime, should be eligible. And I think the predominant view among this group is that we should go for the whole 9 yards. That yes, it's true that there are special considerations when people are young, and that needs to be taken into account. And so they're maybe more likely to satisfy the requirements that would be needed to be released, but it shouldn't be limited to them. And again, I know people who are over 25 and who are radically different than they were. Although I don't really like putting things that way, because that suggests that they were terrible, terrible people at the time. And that's so often not the case, that, they were caught in horrible circumstances. They did something awful, but it's not like they were evil people even back then.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So is your proposal just as a practice to eliminate life sentences and just reserve them for the very few people who really need to be locked up for life?
Yeah, so Norway has one of the model laws on this. They have a maximum sentence of 21 years. I don't know why they decided on 21 rather than the round number of 20. But and the sentence can be extended in certain circumstances. And obviously the details have to be worked out. So Norway has the example of Anders Breivik, the guy who killed 80 people in a summer camp in around 2010, I think it was. I mean,
Yeah, I
talk
remember when
about
that
a
happened.
textbook case. You remember when that happened? You're
Yeah, it
old
was.
enough. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And the guy seems to be totally unrepentant still. I mean, he's in this, Norwegian prison, which is kind of like a nice small liberal arts college dormitory.
Yeah, I remember seeing that because when that happened, I just did a little bit of research about like how their punishment worked in their prison system, and I saw pictures of, I guess, one of their prisons, and I'm just like, what? They have like a recording studio, they have like a rock climbing wall. I'm like, what is this? This is amazing. And when I first saw that, I was actually upset because I thought, like, wait a minute, I thought these people were supposed to suffer. I thought these people were supposed to, be punished. This doesn't seem like a punishment to me, right? But then
Right.
I looked at the recidivism rate for Norway, and it was much lower than ours. And I'm just like, oh, okay, well, I mean, they're doing
Yes,
something
it
right.
works. Well, it does, again, bring you back to this question about whether we think people ought to suffer. I mean, so I'm just writing something now, which I'm, thinking of the philosopher's science fictiony example, the person who commits a terrible crime and has all the mens rea, all the guilty mind you could want, wakes up the next morning and he's transformed and horribly sorry for what he did, horribly repentant, will never do it again, let's assume. Do we think that person should be punished and should suffer? Now, again, part of the thing is, if you believe that a person is repentant, that seems to imply that they must be suffering because they're thinking, I killed someone, I didn't have a good reason, and that's a horrible thing to do. I can never live this down. And so people talk about the idea of moral injury. I mean, that's a terrible moral injury. And do we want someone to suffer over and above that? Well, yeah, a lot of people say yes. But is that in order to send the message? Is that for that forward-looking reason? Or what is it? I mean, why would we want someone to suffer if they were no longer capable of doing this and were fully regretful? I don't
Yeah.
know. This is where I don't know if I'm a retributivist deep, deep down.
Yeah. And honestly, I mean, to truly know if they're repentant, I feel like we would have to be able to read their minds, so there's that epistemic limit as well,
Right.
But you're
Well,
saying that this
that's
Breivik guy, he's not repentant at all, at least.
apparently not. I haven't
Okay.
looked into him lately. Well, it's true. So there's the question of knowing whether someone is likely to commit a crime. That might be easier to know, but knowing whether someone is truly repentant or whether they're faking. And it's clear from parole boards and things that they take that seriously. They think it might well be that someone is just doing it for show. And how could you ever be certain? Well, insofar as you can be certain of what other people think and feel, maybe you can be certain. I don't know. I feel some of the people that I have met in prison who have been released and some who haven't, I do feel absolutely confident that they are repentant and that they are not a danger to public safety.
I see. So maybe if you spend enough time with them, you can get a sense.
You can certainly get a sense. I mean, whether it's infallible, do we ever know for sure what the person closest to you is thinking, and et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera.
Yeah. I mean, again, it depends on how extreme you want to go and how skeptical you want to be. No, that makes sense. So you say that the Norwegian model is better, right? 21 years is like generally the maximum, but then in extraordinary cases they will extend it, and then will
Right.
they continue to extend it until the person
I
dies,
think
or
so. I think
okay?
so. I should do a little more research on this. I should say, by the way, that this proposal of mine is not particularly original. 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, a couple of people from the Sentencing Project, one of the very good organizations, nonprofits that does research and advocacy for criminal justice reform, Mark Maurer, who was the director of the Sentencing Project at the time, although he's retired, and Ashley Nellis, a researcher there, published a book called The Meaning of Life, in which they argue for a maximum 20-year sentence, and other people have too. And it's, somewhat arbitrary figure. I mean, some people might think it should be even shorter.
Yeah. So, okay, so a lot of these criminals or the people who committed these crime, that they did it when they were young, right? So let's say maybe they were about 20 when they committed those crimes. So if the maximum sentence is about 20, so then they would be released around 40. And it's usually by that time that people become much more peaceful. And 20 years is a lot of time to kind of where a transformative experience would take place, just namely due to you being in prison and due to the fact that you're just getting older.
Right.
Uh-huh.
But imagine also that if prisons were different, if they weren't these punitive places with just awful conditions and insufficient programming, substance abuse, mental health, education, if they had all those things, it might be that people could come out even sooner.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So then you think that if your proposal was adopted, the recidivism rate would not change, or do you think that would actually be better? Like, because I think at least I had this thought before, that prison actually makes the people in it worse,
Sure.
right? So maybe you did make this terrible mistake when you were younger, but then now that you've been in prison for 10 years, is making you even, like a much worse person than you otherwise would have been.
Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, if you were in these horrible circumstances, maybe you still would have been really a bad, I don't want to say a bad person, but you know what I mean, if you'd been on the outside. But on the inside, yeah, you can get even more involved in gangs and all those things. Yeah, it's kind of a miracle to me that a lot of these people found their way. Some of them, it took a long time. So, one of my students, for example, told me this is not even for a murder, but attempted murder, and he had a life plus 20 years sentence. And for a long time, he thought he was never going to get out. And so he said he just tried to get high as much as he could. And that was very easy,
Mm.
easier to get drugs on the inside than on the outside. And then when finally, after he had been in for about 15 years, the laws were relaxed and he thought he might have the opportunity to get out one day, that changed his life.
I see.
But you imagine if prisons were truly rehabilitative, and from the moment you went in, you were given programs and taught things, and it could all be very different.
Yeah, you think that they should be rehabilitative. Am I understanding you correctly?
Sure.
Yeah, because why wouldn't we want
Why
them to re
wouldn't we want that? Well,
Yeah.
the only reason would be if you think that someone did wrong, they should suffer for the rest of their life, or
Hmm.
something like that.
What do you think about the death penalty? Like, what does this have to say about the death penalty? Is it just versus life in prison?
Yeah, well, it's funny because I'm writing a book on this at the moment, and at the so far the death penalty hasn't come into it, and it's partly because I just think, well, everything I say is an argument against the death penalty too, so I don't really need to bother with the death penalty, but I probably will at some point. Um, yeah, I mean, I think the death penalty is problematic for lots of different reasons, including racial bias, socioeconomic bias,
Yeah.
irreversibility, mistakes, all the things that people uh, invoke in opposition to the death penalty. But it seems to me all the reasons I give for being against life sentences apply to the death penalty too. So it's kind of, I don't really need to talk about that so much, but maybe that's not right. I'll see how
Yeah.
I feel when I get to the end of the arguments of the rest of the arguments.
I feel like one of the strongest arguments against something like the death penalty is that we've we've executed innocent people, right? I think that's, I mean, and just the risk of executing somebody innocent really should give everybody pause, right? About what type of punishments we really want to implement in our society. I'm wondering if that worry would also be another argument in favor of abolishing life sentences as a general practice, that some people in jail who suffered these life sentences are actually innocent.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, of course, the defenders of capital punishment will say that, yeah, there's always the risk, but of executing an innocent person, but because the death penalty has deterrent value, which it doesn't actually, but they claim that it does have deterrent value, and so you might actually be saving 7 innocent people for every innocent person that gets executed. There are a lot of things you could say about that argument, but I mean, life sentences have the advantage that at least they can be reversed. But yes, there are lots of people who have served decades and decades and then were exonerated.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if there was good evidence to show that a handful of people or some number of people were actually innocent, right? I think that would also be a strong argument to lessen the punishment,
There
because if
are,
you,
there's
yeah,
pretty clear evidence of people serving decades who are innocent. So
yeah, because that type of evidence would seem to be very powerful for people who believe in retribution, right? Because the people who are retributivists, like they don't want to punish somebody who's innocent. Like nobody wants an innocent person to suffer, right? So if
right.
you like, the way to strengthen the argument is to show that there are flaws in the system, right? So and I think this is kind of piggybacks off of the racial disparities that you've mentioned earlier. Like I remember looking this up briefly, right? There was a report that showed that there's a discrepancy in sentencing based on race, even if the prisoners are like similar in their criminal history or something like that,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So the justice system to a certain extent is unjust, right? And we are trying to make progress in this front, but given that it's still imperfect, we don't want to have these super harsh punishments, given the fact that we may make a mistake.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I makes a lot of sense, except that, people will say, well, the good thing about, I mean, if you're not executing somebody, then their innocence is always available to be proven or something like
Yeah,
that.
they can always be released back into society.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember, I think I forgot the guy's name, but I think he was a contestant on America's Got Talent or something like that. He was a singer, and I think he said that he was serving a life sentence or something like that, and he got exonerated by the Innocence Project or something like that.
Yeah.
And like when you hear stories like that, I mean, they're just so powerful. It's just like, oh my God, like so like this person has suffered such a grave injustice by the justice system, and there's almost nothing that we can do to make up for that.
Yeah, no, it's not uncommon.
Yeah.
I mean, the number of people who've been executed who were innocent is probably quite small by if I'm remembering correctly, or at least the ones that we know were innocent. But people being exonerated, I mean, you think of the Central Park Five, who were spent years in prison for the rape of the Central Park jogger, and then were exonerated. I mean, that was like five people.
Hmm.
I know a variety of people who've been exonerated. It's not that unusual.
Yeah. Do you think that the role of for-profit prisons is important here?
I don't really have a view about that. I mean, I haven't studied for-profit prisons enough. I mean, I'm sort of instinctively opposed to them because it seems like people shouldn't be making a profit on prisons. But I'm not sure quite how that, my interest that bears on my interests
Hmm.
and in the question about life sentences. I mean,
Hmm.
presumably for-profit prisons would have an interest in not shortening sentences because that would give them less business. So but I don't really have a whole lot to
Yeah.
say about this.
Oh, that's fine. I think it's really interesting and important that you have had personal experience teaching in prisons and getting to know different prisoners. Have you suggested your proposal to these prisoners at all?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, what do they have to say?
I think they're in favor of it
Yeah.
for the most part. It's interesting now that you say this. I mean, I spend time in prisons also when I'm not teaching, just sort of hanging out and mentoring some of the people I know and keeping them abreast of some of the activity on the criminal justice reform front on the outside. And so they are very interested in things like the second look legislation, which I mentioned earlier, giving people a chance to have their cases looked at again and their sentences modified. Felony murder rules, which, felony murder rule, which exists in many, many states, although it's been abolished in most other countries, which say that if you are involved in a felony that ends up with someone dying, you can be convicted of first-degree murder. And there are bills to abolish felony murder. Anyway, those kinds of bills, most people in prison are very interested in for obvious reasons. So yeah, they are. I haven't had a prolonged discussion and I'm sure that the people I know would agree that there are some people, I've heard them say that there are some people who should never get out, but that's the vast minority, I think.
Yeah. Did you have any preconceived notions before you started teaching at a prison
About,
about the prisoners themselves? Like did you have any like what were you surprised by? Like what did you learn?
well, I continue to learn things, but I don't know. I guess I maybe I didn't expect. I don't really think I had given it a lot of thought, so I'm not sure what my expectations were. But I'm not sure I expected that it would have such a deep effect on me, and that there would be so many of these people, not just a handful, but really a lot of them that I felt very close to. And you have, it's a very unusual relationship, and there's a way in which a lot of these people you connect with on a level that you don't connect with people in ordinary life so much. I don't know, it's hard to explain.
Let me see if I can give a summary of your argument, right? So, two two basic ways to justify punishment. One's forward-looking, one's backward-looking. The forward-looking one doesn't justify life sentences. The backwards-looking one might justify life sentences, but when you dive deeper into the arguments, you don't think that it actually does justify sentences, partly because of the age that these crimes were committed, how immature the people were, the unfair, the injustices within the justice system itself, the fact that these people do change over time. Right. So it's fair to ask the question whether or not it really is the same person. Literally, they're the same person, but their personality has changed, their character has changed, their dispositions have changed. And so your proposal is to have some system kind of like Norway's, maybe not exactly like Norway's, but having some general limit of a maximum sentence, and then maybe make certain exceptions for extraordinary cases.
That sounds right. There were a couple of things I was gonna. First of all, when you said injustices within the criminal justice system, but it's also injustices in the society at large that
Yes.
lead some people into the criminal justice system more than others, and then there are further injustices within the system. And again, I wouldn't want to limit the idea that people change to people who were very young at the time. People can go through those changes even after they have become adults. And, maybe the last thing is just, it's hard to know what kinds of changes in people we could expect if we had a system that really focused on rehabilitation, which we don't. And it's kind of shocking that even leaving aside the grisliest crimes and all, that we are willing to throw people away especially at a young age, even for relatively minor crimes, and put them in these terrible circumstances. It just seems such a waste of human resources.
Yeah, no doubt. So you said that you're currently working on a book. Is this book about life sentences?
Yeah, it's kind of an expansion of the piece I wrote for Eon. I kind of think of that article as a précis of the whole book. I just have to, multiply it 10 times and I'll have a short. I want to write, there's so much written about criminal justice, both, so by social scientists, by legal theorists, people who teach criminal law, by philosophers, very intense philosophical work, but doesn't seem to me that there's a good overview of these issues that is philosophical but written for a general audience. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Wonderful. I look forward to reading that book when it's published.
I look forward to writing it. No, I look forward to reading it also.
Thank you so much for this interview. I found the topic really fascinating.
Thank you for your excellent questions and for wanting to do this. I really appreciate it. It's probably helped me work out some of the kinks